Hello and welcome. I'm Jeannie Long, Executive Director of Chicago Collections Consortium. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Chicago Collections, we're a consortium comprised of libraries, museums, and cultural heritage organizations, all working together for the preservation, promotion, and sharing of Chicago's rich history and culture. Tonight, I'd like to thank CCC member Chicago Public Library and the team there for hosting tonight's program, and a special thank you to the American Institute of Architects Chicago, who's partnering with us on this program. We're excited to welcome authors Dr. Michelangelo Sabatino and Susan S. Benjamin, who will be discussing their recent publication, Modern in the Middle, Chicago Houses 1929 to 75. Joining the discussion is Dr. Neil Harris and Dr. Teri Edelstein, who many of you may know from their book, Chicago Apartments, A Century and Beyond of Lakefront Luxury. I'd like to welcome Neil to the discussion. Hi, Neil. And Neil, I think we need to...
Now I'm unmuted.
There you go.
Great, it's nice to be here tonight, and it's a pleasure to introduce the audience to Modern in the Middle and the two scholars who are principally responsible for its appearance. While many of you probably already know them, I will take a few minutes to explore the book and then very concisely say a few words about the two principal authors. The book first, for those of you who do not yet know it, and I hope many of you will shortly, it's beautifully printed by the Monticelli Press with both black and white and colored photographs and many floor plans. Modern in the Middle is built around identifying, describing, and interpreting some 53 homes that fit its definition and constitute its major focus. It also addresses, both directly and by inference, the larger themes of how, why, and through whom a taste for the modern could be simultaneous. A taste for the modern penetrated the middle of the United States, and that was a taste that could be simultaneously aesthetic, cultural, political, and social. It penetrated Middle America, if you will, during dramatically different eras of history, the Great Depression, the war, World War II, and post-war recovery. Who were these architects? The book asks a series of rather specific questions. Where were the architects trained? Where did they travel? Who were their clients? How did they earn a living? How did they make contact? How much did the houses cost? What communities hosted them? What were the building materials? How long did construction take? How were they furnished? By whom? Who planned the interiors? How were they landscaped? Questions that all of us have about houses that interest us, but very rarely can we answer. The relatively brief but pungent individual house narratives are preceded by two deeply researched and far-ranging essays which provide geographical, cultural, intellectual, and professional context for the cameo appearances that follow. In an era of major international change, American architects were now interacting with colleagues whose arrival in this country was prodded by economic disaster, fascism, war, and new opportunity. Modern in the Middle exposes a complex mingling of stylistic approaches, and hybridities is the term applied by one of the authors, which belie the notion of sterile white cubes that so many at the time might have taken as the modernist icon. Variety, not formula, was the norm here, an integration of many influences. Along the way, a series of quietly heroic figures are uncovered or resurrected by Benjamin and Sabatino, and they stand alongside their more loudly heroic colleagues. Think here Frank Lloyd Wright, Mies van der Rohe, Stanley Tigerman, and Bertrand Goldberg. Many of these lesser-known architects were marching to the notes of their own music, drawing on American and European precedent, but grafting onto them their own special variations. If their names, like David Haid, Roy Binkley, Edward Dart, William Ganster, just to name a few, remain somewhat obscure, Modern in the Middle should help change that. As it will for their clients, their patrons who form an important part of this book. A few of them were quite wealthy, worldly, and privileged. Walgreen, Kuppenheimer, Adlai Stevenson, these are names we recognize. But most of them were not, and formed a well-educated group of upper middle-class professionals and business people, cosmopolitan, well-informed, idealistic, and individualistic. They had the courage, and the authors use the adjective adventurous. They had the courage and perseverance and confidence to seek out their architects of choice and back up both conviction and taste with an investment of time, energy, and sometimes significant amounts of money. The clients are generally listed as couples, with spouses invariably appearing with their pre-married names, appropriately so, for decisions on where and how to build were often joint decisions. And many of these spouses kept both their own names and their own careers. As one introductory essay points out, for the most part, these were not country houses, weekend retreats, villas, or dachas, like many of their counterparts in Europe. They were principal residences, places where the families lived on a full-time basis. They reflected their chosen lifestyles. Each house tale is different, but almost all reveal the presence of some kind of passion. The individual stories, again, are fascinating and well told with appropriate and sometimes surprising details. They're also documented by carefully chosen images, both of interiors and exteriors, some by acclaimed professional photographers like Edward Blessing, but others more obviously by amateurs. In essence, we get small domestic biographies of the 53 homes, reconstructions of the lives of those who lived within, and the ambitions of those who designed them. But more than the recovery of individual architectural reputations or revelations of stylistic variety, as important as these are, Modern in the Middle addresses and evokes the still more significant currents of mood and taste, probing the influence of exhibitions, periodicals, texts, world's fairs, and publicized personalities who promoted this collective achievement. And the book helps us move toward an understanding of this new kind of sensibility, one emerging in these years, a willingness to move beyond established tropes of domestic comfort and commodity accumulation toward a distinctively American, even Midwestern accommodation with modern practices, ideals, and functions. There were never enough clients, of course, for architects inflected by the modern bug had to struggle to find them. Fully 1/4 of the books of the houses included in the book were built by architects for themselves, and a number of others for relatives. But the modern taste was swelling. Think of the many hundreds of clients who purchased at the same time apartments in buildings designed by Mies van der Rohe and other modernists in just these same years. These were not custom built for the residents, of course, but moving into a modern structure for many was a statement of affiliation. How much did they resemble the clients described in this book? There is a lot more to learn, and we are on our way. To compile, interpret, manage, and describe all this requires expertise, training, and experience that move beyond formal credentials. And Benjamin and Sabatini wonderfully complement each other in fascinating ways, bringing different talents to the joint task. Susan Benjamin is an architectural historian trained at Brown and the University of Minnesota. She's written several books on Chicago area houses and architects and has taught at various local institutions. Most of all, she has spent decades preparing the thick descriptions necessary for building nominations to various landmark designations. Her firm, Benjamin Historic Certifications, and a predecessor have created more National Register nominations than any other in Illinois, a range including apartment buildings, schools, warehouses, districts, and of course, houses. These assessments have led, of course, to ongoing interest in preservation and management of historic resources. They have given her an unrivaled insight into the state of the built landscape in Illinois and an experience translating the combinations of stylistic innovation, technological expertise, and historic associations that constitute the basis for landmark status. Susan Benjamin's colleague in authorship, Michelangelo Sabatini, architect, historian, and preservationist, holds degrees from the University Institute of Architecture in Venice and a PhD from the University of Toronto. His scholarship has been cosmopolitan, encompassing the Mediterranean world, the Middle West, the Southwest, and Canada. His books and articles have won a series of prestigious awards, and I won't go into them here, there's no time, and he's held fellowships at Harvard, the Newberry Library, the Canadian Center for Architecture, and the MacDowell Colony. More than that, Michelangelo has been an active teacher and administrator, serving as Dean of the College of Architecture at the Illinois Institute of Technology, during which time he dramatically raised enrollment and ranking and created a series of institutional initiatives. He is currently directing the PhD program at IIT. Like Susan Benjamin, he is an active preservationist. Both authors live in houses that Modern in the Middle describes. In Michelangelo's case, the Silvia Bella and Francis Benda house in Riverside, which he is restoring with his partner, Serge Ambrose, another author of the book. In Susan's case, the Ruth Danielson and Hilmer V. Swenson house in Highland Park. They make for an impressive combination of strengths and practical experiences, and these will now be tapped into as the conversation begins. So I yield the floor to Susan and Michelangelo and their wonderful book as they explore its genesis, meaning, and outcome. And now over to you, Susan.
Unmute, Susan.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And Neil, your introduction was comprehensive and thoughtful, and we're so grateful that for the time that you've put in to describe and lay the foundation for the work that we have done. The cover of our book, Modern in the Middle, with the title centered in the middle, came from Barry Bergdahl, who was director of curator of architecture at MoMA and is presently teaching at Columbia. And I do want to give a shout out to collections, because without access to the archive, this is a photo of the Kunststätter House, one of hundreds in our book by the Hedrick Blessing Archive at the Chicago History Museum. Without these archives, libraries, and drawing collections, we would not have been able to do this book. So you are doing a service to all of us authors in this world. And for that, we thank the library and collections and the other archives that we had the ability to access. Next, please. The houses in our book are from all over Chicagoland, and they extend from the Ganster House in Waukegan, a beautiful steel and glass structure on a ravine. To the south, the Heimbach House in Blue Island by Bertrand Goldberg. In Chicago, Dawn Clark Netch's house, designed by her husband Walter, and the Fraser House in Geneva. The whole breadth of the Chicago area is represented in our book. And you can see in this image itself the great variety of modern structures within the Chicago area. Next, please. And so Modern in the Middle, that was what the title that Barry thought up and we love. Middle of the country. That's where Chicago is. Next, please. Architectural middle ground. That's kind of a big deal. But after Frank Lloyd Wright designed his first Usonian house in 1936 in Madison, and after Mies van Roo came to the United States to head up the architecture department at Armour Institute, their impact on Chicago was tremendous. The architects who followed them rejected them, embraced them, but seldom ignored them. They were the, as I call them in my essay, the giants in the room. Next, please. As you can see, this blend of influences on the Edward Dart House with its broad overhangs and yet vast expanses of windows that we associate with European modernism, the Wrightian, more organic architecture of the Schweiker house, which is currently a house museum, as opposed to the Miesian impact on Roy Binkley's house. Roy Binkley was at IIT when Mies was teaching there. His daughter, who was kind enough to provide us with this image, describes it as their glass box. Next, please. So who are the clients? I mean, that's what's really interesting to us, that this is not a book about lifestyles of the rich and famous. So the clients tended to be progressive thinkers, middle-class individuals, frequently in the arts. Ben Rose, and I had the privilege of knowing Ben and Fran, built their house in Highland Park, and I know that Michelangelo is going to tell you a little bit more about that. He was an incredible fabric designer. He had a studio at the Mart, in addition to in New York. He created these marvelous, whimsical designs. His first job was, for instance, designing refrigerator covers for Frigidaire and seat covers for Pontiac. So, I mean, that's where he made his money, enable him to build his wonderful home in Highland Park. Next, please. Adlai Stevenson. Adlai was a 35-year-old lawyer when he and his wife built their home in Libertyville that they called the farm. The house that is there today is currently the Center for Democracy, is this very pleasant house by Perkins, Wheeler, and Will. I'm very familiar with them because they designed our house, and we were fortunate to have these wonderful drawings that we got from the Forest Preserve District to include in the book. But this was, next please. This was Adlai and Ellen's second house. The first house was they called their mechanical house. It was steel. It was designed by Adlai had been to the Century of Progress, and so he knew the work of Howard. Help me, Michelangelo. I'm having a senior moment.
I'm sorry.
Help me. I am having a senior moment. Howard, the architect for the house. Howard.
Oh, Fisher.
Howard Fisher. Well, thank you for jumping in on that. Howard Fisher designed a house in the exhibition of houses at the Century of Progress, and designed the steel house, the steel fireproof house that burned. And so when it burned and they lost a lot of valuable material, when he wanted a more traditional house, and Howard Fisher said, I don't do this. So he referred him to Perkins, Wheeler, and Will. Next, please. And Adlai, of course, he lived in this house on the Des Plaines River. He called it his farm. He would get up in the morning. He would come downstairs and maybe go for a walk to the river, and then come to work in his study there. He, of course, was governor of Illinois and then subsequent to that ran for president of the United States in 52 and 56. Next, please. The consummate diplomat. He entertained many famous people: Walter Lippmann, Eleanor Roosevelt, Richard Daley. He had an event for for Bobby Kennedy when he ran for president, and you can see the house in the background. Next, please. But when he traveled, and he traveled all over the world, he was appointed by John F. Kennedy ambassador to the United Nations. But the farm was always his home, and this is where he relaxed with his family and enjoyed his life. Next, please. Many, as Neil pointed out, many of the architects designed houses for themselves because they could be more adventurous. And the buildings we associate with Philip Mayer, of course, are this pair of fabulous apartment buildings that Neil writes about at 1260 and 1301 Astor. Very chic, stripped down Art Deco. But for his own house, he designed an extremely international style. Unfortunately, now gone. It was located in Lake Bluff. Next, please. The Katherine and Lloyd Lewis house was designed for property right near Adlai's home. They were friends of Frank Lloyd Wright, as you can see. Lloyd Lewis was a journalist. He wrote award-winning books on Lincoln, on General Sherman, and on Chicago. And you can see how this Usonian house, play on United States of North America, moderate income housing, affordable housing for progressive thinker like the Lewises. And you can see how the way it relates into its setting with pierced overhangs, broad overhangs, projecting decks, and how comfortable it is on the banks of the Des Plaines River. Next, please. And the interior, very typical of the Usonian houses. There were only two that he designed in the Chicago area, but their influence was tremendous, and there were many throughout the United States. Here is a property that you would associate with Wright, with its fireplace, located in a prominent location and a universal space, and yet a dining area just off to the side in a more intimate setting. The Schweiker house in Roselle, Schaumburg today, has a very similar fireplace, and anecdotally it is felt that it is the Schweiker house that influenced Wright, and Schweiker was a great admirer of Wright, by the way, that the carpenters from working on the home had been actually to the Schweiker house. Next, please. The Ellen and Lambert Ennis house is located on Daniel Burnham's property on Dempster Street in Evanston. He was a professor at Northwestern, and it was very cleverly designed so that it was a professor's students could visit his office and yet the house could be very private, and they could enter the office without ever having gone in the house. It's unlike the house on the Des Plaines River, it is right at the street. Next, please. And you can see the influence of both the Wrightian component of the houses we talk about and the international style. William Decknatel attended Taliesin in 1932 when Wesley Peters was there, and so was very imbued with the teachings of Frank Lloyd Wright. You can see it in the characteristics of this house, similar to his Usonian houses with the pierced overhang and the chimney core, but a beautiful garden setting at the back. Notice the windows, broad expanses of glass. Next, please. Published in a book article on modern windows. These were unusual in the sense that they fully opened. They had no center mullion bars, so they could provide light and ventilation completely on the interior. Next, please. A very interesting house in Evanston is the Doris and Thomas Mullen house. Notice the size, 1,200 square feet, 25-foot cube, basically. Allison Fisher has called it a stripped down foursquare, and it to some extent that is the case. Bertrand Goldberg, who would have thought, 1936. The L-shaped plan on the first floor and bedrooms above. Next, please. Opening onto a terrace at the back, extending the rather minimal space of the interior to the outside. Next, please. Interestingly, very easy house to live in. has 2 bedrooms and a bath upstairs. One bedroom has a sitting room separated by screens from the staircase, so when a guest was visiting, they could be afforded total privacy. Next, please. Another house by Bertrand Goldberg, 1951. It is basically 8 cylindrical columns and 3 slabs. The client were Rachel and Ralph Elstein. A shout out to both of them, and this is why it was so important that we included both the spouse and the husband in describing them for the book. They were very influential and important in their own right. Nina Elstein, who I had lunch with, said, "This book wouldn't have happened without my mother." Ralph Elstein was a very important labor leader. He grew up in Minneapolis, as did I, a rather anti-Semitic community at the time. And so he grew up with a sense of social justice. And he was attorney for the meatpackers and then ran the union. This is a photograph of the interior. Next, please. Very much influenced by Le Corbusier's Domino House, which could be, when built up, was a high-rise, when built lengthwise, was could be townhouses, but totally you could divide the interior space. However, this photo on the of the apartment building is what was there prior to the time that Elstein had this house commissioned built by Bertrand Goldberg. Imagine a progressive thinker like him choosing a progressive architect. And in mentioning Rachel Elstein, she was a very important woman in her own right, having gone to San Francisco to consult on the formation of the United Nations. So a very progressive couple. Next, please. And here's a floor plan, glazed on the ground level. First floor had living, dining, universal space, kids' rooms. Upstairs was the master area with, next please, with the, what you saw before, the pierced concrete balcony overlooking the living room with the furniture, designed by Bertrand Goldberg. And here's one of their daughters going up the staircase to the main floor. Next, please. And the interior that could be divided, however, and a very, very wonderful house. This is the top floor, which was their the master living area. Houses for home, I think a pretty spectacular home. Next, please. It was, believe it or not, it was kind of difficult finding a woman architect prior to the 1970s, when women began to hold their own and the Chicago Women in Architecture was formed. But prior to that time, there were not very many successful women architects, and only one modernist that really, other than Gertrude Kurbis, but one who focused on residential architecture. Take a look at the cartoon. I love it. Yes, why, yes, I'm a small homemaker. I'm in construction and I build small homes. So it all began to come together in the 70s, but Jean Wareham designed this very organic Wrightian house in 1960. Next, please. And these are some images of her house that shows the fireplace core and the use of natural materials and the broad overhangs. It had an atrium with palm trees in it, huge glass surroundings in this forested setting. Next, please. And a more, as opposed to a more Wrightian approach, a more international style approach. Margaret Berman and Paul Lurie house by Jim Nagel, who passed away in January, but he loved this house. They're the original owners. They love it as much today as when they hired Jim to design. It was Booth and Nagel then. Designed so that 2 walls are glass and 2 walls are this oversized hard burned brick. Next, please. It's important to see the plan, and we've included many plans to show how the spaces are really divided by furniture or by curving walls, totally independent of the structure of the house. Next, please. And what's really interesting and wonderful today, as one of my clients said, if we're going to have a staycation, we better love where we're staying. And Margaret and Paul have, and and they too are both very accomplished people. He is an attorney who, can we possibly bring the picture back, I think?
Oh,
Paul is a very,
sorry.
that's okay. Paul is a very accomplished attorney. He was a founder of the Chicago Architecture Foundation with my husband. Margaret has always been politically active on the library board and school board, and they are very typical clients of those in our book. Next, please. Next, please. And to show you just how they have adapted their house over the years, the previous slide shows how that they have changed it so that what were bedrooms for their kids are now an office and a guest room, and the staircase is not to the rec room downstairs, but to a gym. Next, please. And finally, I will end with our house, which we love. It was designed in 1941. Larry Perkins, Wheeler and Will designed it. We love the way it nestles in nature. Ruth and Helmer Svensson, he was an ad guy. He coined the term, say it with flowers. And this is how we live in our house. You know, it's with modern furniture that we love, and big glass room that was added in the 60s at the back where we can enjoy our yard. And I think that very largely it was this house and the experience I had working in the past on modernism that was an impetus for me to write this book, which was a pleasure, and share ideas with Michelangelo, who we do compliment each other, and we had a lot of fun. So with that, I want to turn it over to you, Michelangelo.
Great, thank you. Does everyone hear me? Susan, can you hear me?
I can.
Great. Well, I wanted to first off say thank you to Jeannie Long from Chicago Collections and Mariela Colon from Chicago Public Library. And of course, AIA is also a sponsor of this evening's event. And I want to do a special shout out to Joan Pomerank, who is the program director of AIA, and the former executive director of AIA, Zurich Esposito. They were very helpful through the AIA Chicago Foundation in supporting the book. So to them and to all, including Neil and Teri, who you'll see shortly, I want to express my sincere thanks. I will proceed. So I'm particularly happy to have Neil introduce us because, of course, the book on Chicago apartments is all about multi-unit buildings that Chicago has been very known for, and of course, along the lakefront. We, of course, chose, and as you see, I'm sitting in Crown Hall, or a virtual Crown Hall, the epicenter of Mies van der Rohe's teaching. Our book basically, though, sort of takes issue with reduction of sort of the history of residential architecture in Chicago to just two giants. That is Frank Lloyd Wright, whose Roby House you see to the left, and to the right, the Dr. Edith Farnsworth House in Plano, Illinois. While we, of course, acknowledge the importance of these buildings, what we tried to do in this publication, this book, is to expand the reach of the houses in order to show the nuance and the variety of houses within the period 1929 to 75 that we are fortunate enough to be surrounded with here in Chicago. Susan showed the Midwest. Of course, this is a beautiful aerial perspective that I like to show of Chicagoland, Chicagoland being a term that Colonel McCormick coined in the 30s. And you see the great expanse of this shoreline of Lake Michigan to the north, as far as Kenosha, Milwaukee, and to the south, we see Gary. And so we wanted to emphasize the reach of the cities and also neighborhoods and villages that comprise the Chicagoland area, and that give it a very distinct qualities, whether it's the North Shore, the Western suburbs, or the South Side. What makes all these neighborhoods, villages, and cities, whether it's Evanston to the north, or Olympia Fields or Flossmoor to the south? Of course, it was first the network of trains that linked these different towns together, and then, of course, the ubiquitous automobile. We see a beautiful photo of the Zephyr that was launched at the 1933 World's Exposition, and then a view of Erie Lakeshore Drive. Here to the left is an interesting commutation time zones map that shows how the different areas are accessed through automobile and train. So the point here being that although we are focusing on Chicagoland and its various different realities, what really brought them together into one under one umbrella is, of course, the network of transportation. So as Susan mentioned, this was a very interesting, sometimes challenging process where we had a rich amount of possibilities and choices, and we tried to sort of give fair share to a series of well-known, but also, of course, lesser known, but important architects. This is one of the early examples, Irene Tipler and Paul McCurry House. McCurry was an Armour Institute graduate. Armour Institute was the previous name for what is now known as the Illinois Institute of Technology. Paul's daughter, Margaret McCurry, went on to become an architect in her own right, and this is her looking very fabulous on her pony. This flat roof modernist building, also at a certain point you can see there was a sign Paul was practicing out of his home, so it's a home and studio, if you would, that sort of draws upon the Wrightian tradition. We also, as Susan already mentioned, there's a number of Bertrand Goldberg houses, this one being in Blue Island, the Lucille Gottschalk and Aaron Heimbeck house. This house is also very significant from the point of view of its mixed use. Here too, it's live work to the left, the sort of one-story left wing on the left is where Dr. Heimbeck practiced. In fact, the siting of the studio is such that you can walk up right up from the sidewalk. This common brick house took into account a number of influences, European modernist, but also has a certain sort of relationship to the prairie horizontal landscape. As Neil mentioned, we made extensive use of Hedrick Blessing photographs. We were lucky to have the support of the Chicago History Museum, and this is just one of the many that we used. One of the houses that is featured, albeit as part of the biography, author's biography, is this house in Riverside, which is what I call my home, together with my partner. This too was completed in the late 1930s, flat roof with a prominent garage so as to display the new mode of transportation, the automobile. It was completed in Riverside by Winston Elting, who was a Winnetka-born, Princeton-trained architect. And so through the experience of preserving, renovating this house, I was able to really begin to understand the type of research that was necessary and why I would argue this book is necessary. There is far too little research available on single-family houses of a range of architects, including Winston Elting, that would later partner with Schweiker, Paul Schweiker, who is a known that Susan mentioned in terms of the Schomburg house. So these are interesting examples, not always beautiful examples, but interesting examples. To give you an indication of the type of research that needed to be done, even the provenance of bricks, in this case, the production of the autumn tints by the Illinois Bricks was an interesting development whereby they tried to bridge the divide between the cost-efficient common brick and a more costly face brick. And by producing this brick, autumn tints, they were trying to create a reasonably priced brick that could function on all the facades and thereby be also reasonably affordable. So this is the kind of material culture or the underbelly of the research that was very exciting to find. Although we focus, of course, on houses, these houses were part of villages, they were part of cities, and they were part of neighborhoods. I show two examples. Here, of course, is the famous Crow Island School, the Saarinen and the Perkins building that became the model of schoolhouses because it engaged with the landscape, the outdoors. And what's also interesting is to the right is the so-called Blythe School, which is in Riverside. So about 10 minutes walk from the house that I just showed you. And this was Larry Perkins' first independent design. And as you can see, he took up some of the cues from Crow Island, where there was independent access of all the classrooms to the playground. So as I said, although our focus, of course, is on single-family houses, these houses are part of a much more complex sort of landscape of modern architecture. And as a side note, Riverside, of course, was the site of the famed Babson Estate by Sullivan with landscape by Jens Jensen. And so our property overlooks what was the previous Babson Estate, which was sadly demolished in the late 50s, early 60s. And so part of our book points to the rise of a preservation culture that was slowly won through the hard work of many. We will recall that as late as 1957, the Rohe house was threatened with demolition. So we've come a long way, thankfully. Elting's work goes to Lake Forest. This is a house he built for himself. Neil mentioned that an important portion of the book's examples are actually houses designed by architects for themselves and their families. And I think that's always an important opportunity that you're your own client. Also very experimental. Chicago was an epicenter of solar architecture. This is the Keck and Keck Duncan House, Mina Green and Hugh Duncan House. Duncan was a sociologist and author. This was one of the very first sustainable, we would say, houses built in 1941 and still extant. This is Mina looking very warm in her short sleeve shirt, and Hugh outside warming his hands with this snow shovel. So clearly the solar house is doing its job. One of the perhaps lesser known but equally important houses that Mies designed in America, the Isabella Gardner and Robert Hall McCormick House here in Elmhurst, which is now part of the Elmhurst Art Museum and that you can visit. This was designed immediately after the famous Farnsworth House, one-story pavilion that sits firmly on the ground, surrounded by trees that Alfred Caldwell, the landscape architect, planted. And so this is an extension of, one of the examples of a well-known architect, but of a lesser known house. Isabel Gardner was a poet, so it's very interesting to see how shortly after leaving the house, she authors this collection, The Looking Glass, which is an old-fashioned term for saying the mirror. So it's interesting how perhaps one could speculate on how living in a glass house also impacted her own view of the world. This was, the McCormick house was meant as a prototype. Here we see Greenwald, Mies, and McCormick looking at this model. Of course, not unlike the Usonian, this prototype also did not become as diffuse as perhaps the designers would have wished it could. Susan mentioned the Ben Rose house, the Francis Landrum and Ben Rose house. This is particularly interesting because A. James Spire, architect, first graduate student of Mies van der Rohe in 1939, would go on to become an important curator at the Art Institute. What's interesting about this house is that many would go on to claim that IIT's legacy was one that was very much producing architects that were basically doing the same thing. I will argue, and it's not because I'm faculty at IIT, that in fact, while they were embracing principles of the curriculum they had learned at IIT, that they were much more willing to experiment. Here we see the one-story pavilion with vertical boards and a painted sort of brown structure, almost to create a sense of camouflage with the forest. A shout out to Chicago Collections. This specific example, when I was looking for Baldwin Kingery, I did a Google like many of us do, and sure enough, I came to the Chicago Collections platform, and from there, I was rerouted to the Ryerson Burnham Library. So for those of you who want to follow up on Volume 2, be sure to use Chicago Collections as your platform. Moving forward chronologically, one of the few Black architects that we feature in the book, John Warren Matusimi. This is the house he designed for his wife and children, Elizabeth Hunt, who would later also go on to study interior design. Matusimi was a prominent architect of the firm of Dubin, Black, and Matusimi. And he was an IIT grad of 1948. This is an article taken from the Chicago Daily News, speaking to the difficulties that African Americans were experiencing getting loans, mortgages. And so Matusimi was a pioneer, not only as an architect, but also as someone that went out and sought a loan. This is for the Chatham neighborhood of Chicago. Here we see Matusimi next to Jesse Jackson and Johnson, the famous publisher of Ebony and Jet. And so Matusimi was very much part of a kind of a very forward, progressive group of people advocating for diversity and inclusion well before these terms were now broadly accepted. I just wanted to show you that in terms of the South Side, and as I mentioned earlier, there was plenty of modern buildings supporting or alongside the houses. This is the public library in Chatham, this pavilion, one-story pavilion that was actually designed by an IIT grad. So while we have focused, and it was recently renovated by BKL architects, so it's also an interesting example of how modern buildings can continue with another extended life. And then finally, as we're moving to wrap up, I wanted to also draw your attention to this beautiful pavilion in Olympia Fields. It is the Priscilla Hufford and Davis Rockwell House. which consists of these beautifully tapered reinforced concrete piers that, again, taking the Miesian sort of legacy and pushing it toward other forms of materiality and structure. Rockwell was a graduate of IIT, as was David Haid. This is a wonderful single story pavilion courtyard house in Evanston that David Haid designed for his wife and family in 1968, and Stockham Place Park, just immediately to the west of the lakefront. And then finally, a snowy day in Riverside that I'll choose to end this presentation with, thanking all of you. This is us hanging off our balcony after a long day's work, sort of both hands-on and researching the modern. This is Serge, and that's me. And so this, I want to say, encourage all of you in the audience, if you come across a modern house that needs work, there's plenty of experts in the city that can help you. Don't be afraid. We need more stewards, and we need more advocates of modern architecture in the city and beyond. Thank you very much.
Well, I want to, on behalf of everybody who was listening, I want to thank you for those wonderful lectures, Susan and Michelangelo. And I also want to congratulate both of you on this superb book. If you haven't seen the book, you will really enjoy doing so. So I want to urge everybody who is listening to please chime in, just type into the chat any questions that you might have, and I will be routing them to our presenters of this evening. We sort of primed the pump by preparing a few questions ahead of time. So I'd like to begin with them. These are some issues that I personally was interested in knowing more about. So I'm excited to hear the answers of our two distinguished authors. The subtitle of the book, Modern in the Middle, is Chicago Houses 1929 to 1975. Yet the vast majority of the houses, about 87% of the houses in the book, are not within the city limits of Chicago. I wondered, I'd like each of you to just describe one of the issues that led to so many of the homes you chose being outside of the city.
Susan, do you want to take that?
We'll start with Susan, is that all right?
We'll take turns, that's fine. Well, land was available. I guess that's part of the reason as you moved out of the core of the city. And also, I think the interplay between the home, modern house, and nature is intense. That there is a direct relationship either by a house being nestled into its natural setting or setting somewhat apart from it and looking out on it. And that is prevalent in the suburbs.
Great. Michelangelo, do you have anything to add?
I think Susan hit the nail on the head. Clearly, there was a desire to engage with a natural setting. And so the lots or parcels of land were most available. And there was the infrastructure that allowed people to live in these environments and commute to work. So I think that was what drew them to take on that challenge. Others, as you know, preferred the kind of urban living along the lake. And so I guess it was a different kind of mindset or different kind of needs that these families expressed.
Thank you. I noted you don't call it a table of contents, you call it a portfolio. I love that. That's great. What is the table of contents? You list the names of those who commissioned the houses, but you do not list the names of the architects. Thus, you are emphasizing the clients, and Susan talked about that extensively in her presentation. I also note that Susan mentioned there is one woman architect in the book, but that's all. But given that women played almost no role as architects in the particular time period that you're discussing, I wanted each of you, and we'll start this time with Michelangelo, I wanted each of you to give one example where you can talk about a very active role that the woman commissioning the house played in the design process of making the house and creating the house.
Well, Teri, you gave me the easy way out of that because, of course, Dr. Edith Farnsworth. That she, was very active, and in fact, I think much of the pushback she gave to Mies then became sort of a reason for why she was slightly, at the time, demonized, right? It was this, I think, the fact that she would dare challenge the master.
Right? I love that she was pushing back on Mies. Give us a specific example where she pushed on him.
Well, the famous one is Elizabeth Gordon's House Beautiful article, right, where Elizabeth Gordon had embraced Wright in favor of Mies. And so she interviewed Edith, and Edith was although they kept it very anonymous, but everyone knew who they were talking about. And she's saying, this is, I think the term was, it was a glass cage, right? And so I think Edith was making her objections known. And if you think recently, there was a beautiful reinstallation of Edith's original furniture, which is full of, Scandinavian, Italian design, from an Albini desk to Matheson lounge chair. And of course, all of that was erased when the home was purchased by Lord Peter Palumbo. And so what's really interesting is that Edith Farnsworth sort of made sure she introduced her own sort of aesthetic, even her own food dogs, as we know, that have ended up at the University of Chicago Smart Museum, right? So yes, she's a perfect example of a very educated woman that was trying to push back. And I would say that she got as far as the furniture, perhaps not the architecture, but at least she, I think, appears prominent as a client in ways that perhaps others do not. I don't know if that's answered your question.
No, it's an interesting answer. Susan, do you have any example where women were not necessarily just critiquing or putting their own mark on the finished house, but actually actively participating in the design process in some way? Do you have any example of that?
Well, at the other extreme, although I think the role is kind of minimal, the hot dog house that Stanley Tigerman designed. It's because it was a cost-saving thing for them, for the couple, that they lived in Hyde Park and they built this. This is an example, interestingly, like Edith Farnsworth, an area in the country, someplace to have a weekend house. So they engaged Stanley to design this house, and she was an artist. They did a lot of the finish work themselves. That was not so unusual. That happened with Jean Wareheim's, with that house as well, that the couple were involved in that. But I think I have read that the house has the palette of Mondrian, and I'm told that she was very involved in that aspect of it. Now, I also know that Stanley painted like Mondrian, something people probably don't realize, but you go to his apartment and there are paintings he did that in the style of Mondrian. So I can't speak specifically that that's how it happened, but I understand that she did play a role in the color design of the exterior of the house.
Mhm.
I don't know of any story as intense as Edith Farnsworth. I mean, that's
Susan, I'll just carry one last example is the Irma Kuppenheimer and Bertrand G. Kahn house, which was one of George Fred Keck's early sort of modernist houses for Lake Forest. And Irma was she was the one that said, we need a house of the day after tomorrow. So she was the very proactive in commissioning the house. So, there we have a really strong example too early on of a woman that perhaps did not design it, but had very clear ideas of what kind of house she wanted to live in.
And if I can just embellish on that story, because it's a great one. And yeah, she wanted the house of the day after tomorrow, but Irma Kuppenheimer was taking a class at U of C from Professor Gottschalk, and who shared the apartment buildings with Bill and Fred Keck at the time. And so she was looking for this. So he had a dinner party and invited, Fred Keck for dinner. And that is that's the genesis of how that house was born. And then there was you're right, there's this huge interaction about the design of the house. So that's a great story.
We have some good questions from the audience, so I want to jump to them, and then maybe we'll get back to some of my additional questions. I wonder whether you two were in concert on this. Somebody wants to know, why was the date range cut off at 1975? Were there no modern homes made after 1975, or perhaps you had other issues that led you to that decision? Why don't we start with Susan?
That's a really good question, because this is something that I've been thinking about for a long time, and we collaborated upon to test the waters. Was this the right time? And the answer is yes. There were a couple of reasons. The first was, the concept over time about modernism was that there was kind of, Mies came and continued the idea of people like William LeBaron Jenney. Okay, so there was this show at the Museum of Contemporary Art, 100 Years of Architecture, that explored that idea. At the same time, there was a Salon de Refusé at the Time Life building, and that Stuart Cohen and Stanley curated. And I have to mention this as an aside, it brought in people who were lesser known at the time. So it created an approach to architecture that was more holistic. Now the aside, here it comes, is there were no women in that show, which tells you a story too.
Right.
So
what is your take on the process that you and Susan went through, Michelangelo?
Well, precisely the trajectory of sort of the arrival of modernism by way of the Century of Progress exposition, and so the gradual embrace of modernism and all of that. But then with the 60s and the 70s, there came a moment when some of the limits of modernism were beginning to be felt, especially in terms of perhaps lesser quality, sort of more derivative examples of the modern that were then becoming ubiquitous. And so what happened in Chicago was very interesting. It was a battle of the so-called Chicago 7, which came out of the sort of Tigerman and Cohen show that were meant to challenge sort of dominant Miesian hold on the city. And it's not by coincidence that the architects like Jim Nagel and Cohen and others, they were all trained outside of IIT, whether it was Cornell or was MIT. And so there was an interesting moment where architects that were being trained at other institutions outside of Chicago began to question sort of the rational, structural approach that this Mies and the students of Mies had begun. So I guess they were interested in experimenting. So with linguistic sort of, or expanding the idea of what modern was. And so I think we ended the book with 1975 because the two shows were both held in 1976, the two exhibitions mentioned by Susan, 100 Years of Architecture in Chicago and Chicago Architects. And so we felt that that was a perfect moment to sort of end the book. And then in the coda, of course, there's been revivals of the modern, right? If you think of David Hovey's work with Optima, and we think of many others that we feature in the book, John Vinci himself. So I think that's why we ended. I hope the person that is in the audience that asked, I hope I've tried to answer the question, or we both tried to answer this as fully as we can.
Someone wants to know, and maybe since you're sitting there in Miesian splendor, Michelangelo, you'll chime in first on this. Could you comment on the unbuilt 50 by 50 house by Mies and Myron Goldsmith? It seems like a spectacular failure on multiple levels, but it still fascinates.
Right. I am not deeply knowledgeable about that example. I will say that it's interesting in terms of, if you step back in the American post-World War II environment, you know, it seems that in terms of prefabrication or sort of mass housing, you know, the Levittowns of the world seem to have the Cape Cod, the salt box analogy seem to have been much more embraced in terms of by larger swaths of the population than, say, experimental houses that were designed by architects, whether it's Usonians or, as we saw, the McCormick House, you know, that never sort of took off. So I don't know. There seems to be an American reluctance to that type of sort of modernism. And so, you know, if you think even of the case study houses experiment on the West Coast, you know, all of these amazing prototypes were often never, you know, sort of embraced by the intelligentsia, Art and Architecture magazine, and Tenza's brainchild, but they never really were able to sort of be embraced by the larger American public.
You know, I agree with you, and I would like to just add one thing. From all the research I've done over the years, Americans tend to feel comfortable in traditional housing. You know, it harkens back to their roots, whether it's perceived English Tudor or colonial houses, but they seem to reflect comfort and respectability and the status quo. And it takes a progressive thinker, such as the people we investigate in our book, to really extend out a little farther out and take risks, you know, emotionally, you know, in terms of their place in the world. And that's been my experience, that you know, we always kind of revert back, you know, it cycles over time, you know. Modernism mercifully persists, but so does traditional architecture.
And I'm going to end with a question that I know you're both going to love having a chance to answer. And I'll let Susan go first. what is your very favorite home? I will mention, you guys shouldn't mention your own house. Pick a different house. Don't mention your own house. What is your favorite home featured in the book? What are their unique features do they have that make it your particular favorite? So Susan?
Well, I'll tell you. My favorite house is the Schweiker house in Schaumburg in Roselle. You know, it embodies intellectually a combination of organicism and European modernism. But beyond that, I mean, a house is a home. And that is a home to me, the way it relates to its setting, its beautiful use of materials. It's a work of art that it just continues to embrace you. And it has a special place in my heart. It partially because I've been involved in it for over 25 years, you know, writing. It's not just writing the National Register nomination, but going west and meeting with Paul Schweiker and seeing his place in Sedona and becoming friends with a subsequent owner, Martil and Alex Langsdorff. Martil was a very good friend. So I feel like I've lived with the house for over 25 years and I love it. I just think it's a home to be treasured.
So Teri, you're gonna get a kick out of this, but I too would love to be living right now in the Paul Schweiker and Dorothy Miller house. You know, I can still remember, and fortunately those listening or following this evening can all go visit, but I still remember the fragrance of the redwood and the sort of different atmospheres that the house has, cozy but not too rustic. So there's a certain level of sophistication, be that also because Schweiker designed it on his way back from a visit to Japan. The Franz Lipp landscape, and also the work-study scenario. And so, I mean, work-live rather. And, you know, in the day of our pandemic days and hopefully soon to be ended, but, you know, more and more people are embracing the idea of living and working at home. Well, Schweiker, following the Frank Lloyd Wright model, of course, and many others that we've seen this evening, had it all there, you know, and this was, you know, Roselle, Schaumburg, when, you know, you had to commute down into the loop. So it was a very wonderful choice, and the space is incredibly sensual. So here you have it. We're all gonna, if we could, go live at the.
That seems definitive to me. I think whoever asked that question, they certainly got a definitive answer.
Great.
Well, I have the nicest task of the entire evening, which is that I want to thank everyone who's listening for joining us. I want to thank the Chicago Collections and the Chicago Public Library for bringing us this wonderful evening. And most of all, I want to thank Susan and Michelangelo for this splendid, splendid program. And I wish everyone a good night, and everybody stay well.
Thank you, Teri. Good night to all.
Thank you, everybody.